Charge on, you boys of old Buddha, you boys of old past, the day will cease. Students, workers, and youth we shall show, the sun does not rise in the east. We stood guard for 100 days in silence, and dreamed 100 nights of victory. We youth of a new Hungary, we shall make October go down in history. I recall that you had a rifle, bring it to the square when you come. Under my school books and waiting for me is a pistol I got from someone. 6 glorious days and 6 cold nights, we celebrated and we gave thanks. But on the 7th we heard in the early dawn the Russians and their thundering tanks. The tanks crushed all of our bones, and no one in the world will come to help. They watch from the street side as we all die, and the gutters fill with our blood. Oh, please don't tell my mother that I've died. Don't tell her that today will be my last. Darlings say he's going to the mountains, and he'll return when spring has just passed. Oh, charge on, you boys of old Buddha, you boys of old past, the day will cease. Students, workers, and youth we shall show, the sun will not rise in the east. Oh, comrades, we surely have lost. Our dreams of revolution were too tall. Soon they'll take us and they'll bind us, and stand Hungary's youth against the wall. Comrades, we stand before the rifles. The first and the second are already shot, and as each of us falls, so does our freedom and the honor of the world that just watched. Our younger brothers, they will take our rifles. The next youth will wait for their turn, and they'll march to the song and remember this day, and from the mountains we will return. Charge on, you boys of old Buddha, you boys of old past, the day will cease. Students, workers, and youth we shall show, the sun will not rise in the east. Charge on, you boys of old Buddha, you boys of old posts we will seize. The students, workers, and youth will show, the sun will not rise in the east.
Thank you all for tuning in. This is the second installment of the fascist series. This time we'll be talking about the later years of fascism, the corporate state, and its structure. Before we begin, I'd like to apologize for the brief amount of technical difficulties that we had. We intended to start at around 6 o'clock. However, a myriad of different difficulties appeared, and it made it nearly impossible to launch at that time. We are here now, and we're hoping to get into this information here. So, where we left off, we had discussed the early years of fascism, especially in Italy, Britain, Spain, somewhat, Portugal, and a few others, of course. But this episode of the fascist series plans to get into the much later years. First and foremost, those that survived World War II. Now, fascist states during World War II were varied. Some were staunch followers of the corporative system. Others were more puppets at the times. For our inspirations from World War II, we look to Slovakia under Joseph Tiso. We look to Italy under Benito Mussolini. We look to Greece prior to its invasion, of course, under Metaxas with his corporative policy. We look to Salazar in Portugal, who had ruled since 1924, and we look to the opening phases of Spain under Imola before his arrest in the 1940s. The later years of fascism are marked with a variety of difficulties. After the war, the East and West unilaterally agreed that fascism was now the boogeyman of the greater world. In China, the Blue Shirt Society survived the war and was given a pardon from Mao, even though they played a large part in the defeat of early communist armies in the 1930s. In Italy, the MSI would form shortly after the end of World War II in an attempt to Italian fascism and bring it back into the forefront of the popular knowledge. In Spain, the Carlists would gain the upper hand over the Phalangists, and they would force the Phalangists into a relative corner of politics, making them relatively unimportant for the first few years after the war. In Portugal, Salazar would distance himself from the movements of Italy in order to protect his own peoples from the possible colonial attacks that would come with the end of World War II. And though these people seem to be dissuaded, the collapse of many fascist states, such as Italy, Austria, Slovakia, etc., new fascists did appear. Juan Perón of Argentina would come to power in the 1940s, declaring that he would follow in the steps of Mussolini, who was the most genius man he had ever met. And many like this would come forth across the world in an attempt to revive what had so forth just died. Most prominently, as I previously mentioned, the MSI and its attempts would be the torch carriers of the European fascist movement. Although Portugal and Spain continued to nominally continue their fascist regimes, Italy and the MSI would be the only ones who truly held to the ideals of the Mussoliniite fascist policy, which would effectively wash away by the 1990s with its attempt to relaunch as a more conservative, moderate party in its unfortunate end. The most important states that we'll be discussing in this episode will be Argentina, under the rulership of Perón, Spain, post-1955, Portugal, until its unfortunate fall by military coup, and that will be all. To begin, the reason why we state the date for 1955 in Spain is because that is the approximate timing of the so-called technocrat soft coup. What this was an effective change of power from the Carlist old guard and the mixture of Phalangists of the more conservative aspect with the younger generation of technocratic Phalangists. This rapidly led to a massive change in the policy of economics, foreign policy, and of internal social policy that was seen in the Francoist state, where previously it had been a very traditionalist, almost outright reactionary kind of regime. It would now be radically changing into a much more economically literate and, if you will, progressive state, which was the Futurist Manifesto's main goal. First and foremost in Spain at this time, we would see a massive economic climb. From 1955 to 1975, the economy of Spain would triple, if not quadruple. The GDP would grow at unimaginable rates that had never been seen before, and unemployment would drop below 1% at times. When you compare this to the end of the Spanish regime in 1975, the unemployment between 1975 and 1978 rose to 36% overall from its former 1%. This was an unparalleled change of the unemployment, and especially the economical aspect at large, where a large amount of people no longer held in place by the national works programs of the corporate state were left without anything, without a job, without the ability to pay for their homes, and without the ability to make ends meet week by week. This is the truth of the liberal democratic regime. And it's still the truth to this day in many nations across the world. When you compare the aspects of the fascist states of Portugal, of Argentina, of Spain, to the modern-day liberal democracies which have succeeded them, what you see is that unemployment has risen by massive amounts. The GDP has generally softened and fallen from its former position, and the overall strength of the nation has been degraded by the constant bickering and internal politics of a democratic state. Now, these issues are most prevalent in Spain. Portugal and Argentina would see relatively light transitions of power. Portugal seeing the harshest out of the two that are not an outright coup, which is what happened in Spain. And Argentina seeing the softest as a natural transition of power after the death of Perón and his wife, to the more democratic, liberalized parts of the judicialist party, of which he called his own. Economically speaking, the fascist states implemented something called the corporate state, in the goal of achieving the corporate state. The plan effectively was to ensure that over the time, the ability of the nation would become absolutely, fully autocratic or autarky, an autarky, meaning complete self-sufficiency in economical speaking ways. You would see first and foremost a lower reliance on foreign trade, on the international globalist philosophies of trade. You would see a heightened expansion of Keynesian economics, such as the National Works Program. You would see a revitalization of lands formerly thought uninhabitable, such as you saw in Spain, in Italy, especially during the reclamation of the swamps. All of these things would lead to an increased output of gross domestic product, thus increasing the overall fundability of a state. In a glance, when you look at the comparison, the differences, if you will, between the fascist states and liberal states which succeeded them, you saw an immediate drop in almost all habitabilities of living. You saw an increase of unemployment, an increase of crime, you saw an increase of poverty, you saw the middle class significantly decrease, and you saw the GDP generally lower. Now, this was a very common event in the fall of a stable regime. Now, when you look at the corporate state and its facets, what you see is best explained by Thomas A. Raven, which is a book called The Coming Corporate State, in which he describes the plan, especially the fascist ideals of how to implement this economy. Basically, what would happen is the total structure of the state would be completely reformed. You would see a change from the traditional liberal democratic structure of there being a local constituent elected by the population at large, and then him attending the national legislature, whether it be called the House of Representatives, Parliament, etc., anything, the Tosh Nadala, whatever you may call it, your local representative would then attend that legislative body. Under the fascist state, on the other hand, rather than electing a constituent-based MP or Tosh Nadala or, representative, what you would do is you would elect a meritocratically selected, or not even elect, really, you would select a meritocratic leader or representative to attend a national corporations council, or syndicates council, depending on the nation of your home. Spain, most famously, syndicates, in order not to be confused with the modern new word that is corporation, which is a business. So the corporate state would have you as a union worker, of which all jobs would be unionized, even those of the pensioners. It would select a representative from you to attend the National Council of Corporations, the National Councils of Syndicates, which was effectively a legislative body. Now, this legislative body would work in various ways. First and foremost, it would plan and it would implement the policies of economic change that are meaningful here. It would lead to the vast amounts of nationalization, especially what you'd see the nations around the world under fascist rules. You would see industry of all kinds be nationalized by the state and be taken by the government and then re-given out to the unions in order to work within their own worker cooperatives. This is called workplace democracy or independent working, depending on where you live. And it's quite an interesting philosophy of work, which the fascist state planned to implement and did implement in several cases. Above that would be something called the Grand Council of Fascism, or the Upper House, if you will. These people would be selected from amongst the corporations, the Council of Corporations, effectively as ministers. Now, for example, the healthcare, which would be made up of nurses, doctors, pharmacists, etc., would select from amongst all of them, their unions, right, having multiple representatives on the board for each profession. They would select from amongst them one person to represent them as the head of the healthcare corporation or industry or syndicate, depending on who you are and where you live. This would then allow you to implement decisions from the top down in order to better the healthcare system as you saw fit as a professional. Now, in the coming corporate state, there are a list of examples for corporations that would be opened. First and foremost, you see your primary products, your agriculture, your fishing, your mining and fuel, your iron and steel, and your metal trade. And then industrial, you would see the engineering, printing and paper trade, shipbuilding, etc., which would allow you to have these kind of broken down working systems, which each union would then select from. Now, that was the general organization of the corporate state. And I believe I touched on this in the last episode where I talked about the breakdown. However, the important parts to get to are things like economic justice, where in the Coming Corporate State and other books like it, it discusses how economic justice and private ownership and initiative are absolutely supported, but the just way to do things was not have a corporation out for its own gain, not to have a business out for its own gain, but instead to have a business that worked in the interest of the state and the people. So rather than promoting this kind of cutthroat attitude that the modern capitalist system does, the corporatist system promotes instead a very communal aspect of work, where your local grocery store isn't trying to fuck you over constantly in order to, make a dime. Instead, it would be focusing on delivering a primary service. It would be focusing on ensuring that a good quality is given out, and it would work on ensuring that the community remains happy with its work. Now, this is an important piece for a lot of reasons. Because in its organization, the corporate state recognized that the current system was not workable. It recognized that the capitalist system was a completely outdated and unjustifiable system at the current time. In fact, Mussolini, in his famous speech to the corporation, would state something of the like, where he stated that capitalism as a system was outdated and needed to be replaced, and that socialism was inextricably connected to it. Now, what he meant by socialism being inextricably connected to the apologies, I had an internet break there. Connected to the socialists is that he believed firmly that in the rise of capitalism required the rise of socialism. Now, this is a very simple way to look at things. It's called dialecticism. Now, it's informally called Hegelian dialectics, although it was not curated by Hegel. It was used by Kant before him, and in fact, Hegel never directly used this kind of dialecticism. However, it is an incredibly simple and constraining way to look at history. Basically, what happens is there is a thesis. An event happens. For our case, it will be called capitalism. The capital system happens, and that is the thesis. The antithesis is the immediate reaction to the capital. Now, Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, and of course, created socialism shortly after the foundation of capitalism as the main driving economic factor of Europe. Now, this would be the antithesis. This would be the reaction to the thesis. Now, the simple solution, the merging of ideals, which would lead to a better future, is the synthesis, would be the end of the crises, which is what corporatism aims to be, is that synthesis, that curation of a unilaterally connected system. Now, why is this? How does this tie into Mussolini stating that socialism and capitalism are inextricably connected and rely on each other in order to work? Quite simple. Capitalism as a system, in order to justify continuing despite the massive amounts of hardships that come with it, needs some kind of alternative which people can associate with, right? Every kind of democratic regime requires an alternative, an opposition. And Mosley, in fact, states this in his Tomorrow We Live, where he talks about how the ridiculousness of a democracy where you would have a prime minister, head of government, hired for £100,000 per year, and then he would pay his opposition £10,000 per year, or £50,000 per year, or however many pounds per year you pay them, in order to oppose everything that his government did. Now, this is the same effect that dialecticism has upon capitalism and socialism. The two of them are constantly vying for power, are constantly challenging, are constantly fighting with each other over the implementation of their economic ideals. Now, the corporate state rejects this. They state that this is a false dichotomy, that trying to separate yourself into one of the camps only leads to the eventual damage to the state that comes with it. Most importantly, Mussolini recognizes this. In his speech to the national corporations in 1933, he states that corporatism overcomes socialism and overcomes liberalism, which means capitalism, increasing new synthesis. One fact is symptomatic, a fact which perhaps has not sufficiently been reflected upon. This is that the decline of capitalism coincides with the decline of socialism. All the socialist parties of Europe to this day have been shattered. I'm not talking about in Italy and Germany, but about in other countries. Obviously, the two phenomena, I will not say that they are conditioned from a strictly logical point of view. However, there was, among them, a simultaneity of historical order. This is why the corporate economy arises in a determined historical moment. That is, when the two concomitant phenomena, capitalism and socialism, have already given everything they could give. Effectively, they have been implemented to their fullest, which means that the socialists and the capitalists have already done everything in a system that they could possibly do. They've both been implemented, they've both been reached, and the people have both been generally dissatisfied with the outcome. On the other hand, corporatism as an economic system, which has been was fully reached at the time in the 1930s and early 1940s, saw that it had a much higher satisfaction rate. If you compare the historical facts, we see that the Italians earned a wage that was several dozen times higher than the American wage at the time, which was 22 cents American. You see that the Italian unemployment was significantly lower than the rest of the world. You saw that the Italian income tax was non-existent, the property tax non-existent. All these things were completely cut back. All of these changes happened and generally led to a high amount of citizen satisfaction, which is where Giovanni Gentile's philosophy of state comes through. In fact, at one point he stated that there is that for fascism, the state and the individual are entirely one. They're inseparable. Or better, perhaps, these terms are so inseparable that they create a necessary synthesis, meaning that they become one word. And he explains this because, effectively, he effectively states this, and he goes on to say that the authority of the state is not a product, but a presupposition. It already exists. It cannot depend on the people. In fact, the people depend on that state, right? The fascist state, on the other hand, is a complete overhaul of that idea, which was the traditional romantic ideal of a nation. That the nation always existed, that the authority always existed, thus the nation will always exist, and the people must depend on that. The fascist state, on the other hand, completely removes that ideal, and it says that the popular state, in a sense, the democratic state, quote unquote, per excellence. Every citizen shares a relationship with the state that is so intimate, the state can only exist as far as that is made to exist by the citizen. Now, Cadrano explains this in his book, Everything for My Legionnaires, as a popular consciousness, if you will, where the people of a nation are connected by an unconscious desire to be led by that nation. And I mean, philosophy, even in the modern day, does discuss this, how people require leadership, how people seek leadership. This is why strongmen, such as as we've seen in the recent days, the recent years even, strongmen of the populist distinction have come forth to try and fill the void that has been left by the complete lack of leadership in the modern day. So fascism removes that kind of sensibility, and in fact, it originally invented it to show the fact that the people require that kind of leadership. But it removes it now in order to create a popular state, a state that only exists as far as the people do. So that is the effective structure, and of course, the basic philosophy behind it. It's called actual idealism, and it was invented by Giovanni Gentile as an extension of neo-Hegelianism. The important parts of this, although you may be exhausted from listening to a ramble of 23 minutes now on the philosophy of the fascist state, the important part is that it curates this understanding of the fascists who are listening, and those who aren't even, not the non-fascists who are listening, that the state as an existence does not come about as a precipitation of violence, as an existence of force. The fascist state instead relies upon popular unconsciousness, which is why fascist states come and they go. They don't remain forever. They don't use their power of state in order to violently suppress the people, in order to force about the continued existence of fascism. In fact, they silently go when the people no longer need them or no longer want them, which leads effectively to the people becoming, disillusioned with liberal democracy and a full circle back again. And I believe that it's Mencius Mollberg, or Curtis Yvonne, if you will, who discusses this with his neo-reactionary point, that there are three systems of government: oligarchy, monarchy, or singular rule, and democracy, and they switch back and forth throughout the time. Now, this exists because this is how people go. It's a continuing system of history, right? Now, the longest-lasting systems, of course, are ruled by one, or the singular rule, whether they be monarchy of the absolute sense back in the day, or the Leviathan sense of the post-16th, 17th century world. Or are they the dictatorship / democratic dictatorship, or whatever you want to call it, of fascism, the fascist rule? They last so long because of their existence of strength, because of the existence of the unilateral will of the people, rather than relying upon the bickering of the politicians, which eventually derives into internal struggle, like what we're seeing in the United States right now. There is no way to solve the vast amounts of internal struggle that is going on. It has become effectively impossible for the state to contend with the people that are now violently rioting and fighting in the streets. This would not happen under a fascist state. It wouldn't happen under an authoritarian state, because the people would either be understanding that there is an authority, that there are rules to follow, and that these rules are non-negotiable, that they exist, and that they are completely and fully subject to them, or they would be punished for not realizing that simple fact of life. And that is the ultimate simple fact of life, that authority exists and you must come to terms with it. In fact, it is a sign of maturity when people do come to terms with their authority. Now, one may ask, how does a fascist who rejects the liberal democracy come to terms with authority? And it's simple. The fascists, much like we see in Italy with the Casa Pound and Legions, and other states like that, Slovakia, with the People's Party of Slovakia, etc., etc., what we see is that the fascists, instead of subjecting themselves fully to the state, of which they still care for, they instead curate a state without the state. Casa Pound has its own houses, has its own doctors, has its own banks, has its own economic system, effectively. So does the Falun Legions. They have their own abilities to completely in self-sufficiency run their own groups of people. And the reason they do this is to show that without the state, they are still a organized body. And they replace the state where the state cannot go. Casa Pound talks about how the state has effectively abandoned the rural Italians, and so does the People's Party of Slovakia, the Fet de Legions, the Falun de Legions. They talk about this extensively when they talk to reporters or in their weekly blurbs. This is what they state, is that the people of outside the cities are completely forgotten by the state. And this is a reality. I mean, we are becoming more and more urban-centric, which leads to an expansion of agricultural-minded peoples. And I mean, the Americans are the most notable ones that are going through this urbanization, in spite of their founders, such as Thomas Jefferson's, best wishes. I mean, it was Thomas Jefferson who declared that the agricultural landowner, that the worker of the land, had the supreme duty to be the statesman as well, and that the Americans should not rely upon the industry, which turns cities into wildering beasts of smoke and steam, and instead rely upon the ability of their own hands to curate things such as houses, such as farms, such as agriculture, in order to feed and ensure that funding to the United States remains consistent. And that supreme sense of duty, or as a Pound contends, is an exact ability. It has an exact ability to be directly correlated to what modern-day fascism became, especially in the United States, where they understand that what their job is and how to conduct it. The reality is of this all is that we have disconnected ourselves from our roots, from our basic instinct of a nation as a people. And that's what the fascist state, the corporate state, indeed reaches back to. Mussolini's return to the land initiatives, the post-technocrat coup, Spain's expansion of the agricultural product and range. We saw the expansion of agriculture in Angola, Mozambique under Portugal. We saw the return to agriculture under Peron in order to supplement the autarky that he planned to implement. We saw this in Slovakia, Greece, Austria, etc. This return to the land is because it's not because we are some kind of agricultural only centered people. It's because we realize that the people's well-being is directly tied to their ability to self-sufficiently run. And the first and foremost step of self-sufficiency is entirely being reliant upon oneself for food. And in fact, that is one of the leading arguments I've seen against autarkies, that, well, we can't feed ourselves. Or, if you lived alone on a farm and, you only farm this thing, you need everything else, how do you survive, and da-da-da-da-da. This is an inaccurate conception of autarky, because the first and foremost goal of an autarky, of a state that implements autarky, is to ensure that its people are fully and willfully fed and supplied. So when the corporate state is implemented, that is why there is a return to land policy. That is why Italy, although an expanding GDP, fell behind slightly in industry. Despite a growing steel industry, etc., they fell behind in general industry due to their focus on returning people to the land, on returning the ability to feed, to house, to supply their own people to the forefront of a nation build. But now I'd like to get back to the later years of these states before we go too far into the rabbit hole there. Fascism in its later years saw a lot of change, decisive change, because no longer did it need to rely upon the close working relationship that it had initially between industrialized peoples and the and the government at large, which is what Mussolini did in his first few years. Privatization regime in order to instill trust and support from the industrial class. They no longer needed to rely on that because it had other means to achieve that, had other means to do that. So fascism in its later days saw a radical change from what you would have seen in the 1930s. You saw massive industrialization. You saw a generally widespread change of sensibility. You saw them no longer hiding behind that kind of that fear of implementing the corporate state. And no longer did you have to worry about the industrialists countering you with some kind of force, at least for now. Although this would come back to bite them in the proverbial ass. I mean, with Salazar, with Franco, they could not be succeeded because either the monarch had been bought by the corporations overseas that were owned by Spaniards, or the military was simply done with this kind of this change, this radical futuristic change, which was the whole goal of fascism. See, people misconstrue it, construe fascism especially, as this kind of traditionalist mindset, this kind of connection to a tradition, to this, to that. It's never been like that. It's never been about that. Fascism has always been about advance. I mean, the famous quotes of the third positionists, the futurists have always been, speed, violence, forwards, or whatever, the war cry of the Fume Legionnaires. And that whole point was to inspire this kind of advancement, this kind of radical change in the sensibility of the people. No longer were they supposed to be reliant upon age-old traditions, which varied in their ability, but now they were supposed to be completely and utterly have this complete change of mindset in order to advance, to constantly be changing. That was the important part of the futurist sensibility. Now, people will say, well, progressivism. It's not the progressivism that you would see in the modern day. The wanting people to, cut off their dicks or whatever. That isn't the progressivism that futurism pushed, and that's not even progressivism at all. In fact, Rivera would make a statement in 1936 that was oddly prophetic about this when he talked about how the left progressive wants to destroy everything that exists, even that which is good, and the right wing traditionalist wishes to conserve everything, even that which is bad. And that is the ethos of the futuristic change of the fascist progress, is that it's not about massive social change. It's not about accepting all this different stuff that's happening in the modern day. It's about decisive and reasonable change in the ever marching time, right? Because things will always be changing. That is the reality of being a human being. That over time, things will radically change. Things will become different from what they are now, and over time, people will and their sensibilities will eventually shift. So the traditionalists, although there were a few fascists who subscribed especially to the tradition, such as Salazar, realized that progress would come, even if they didn't want it to, and things had to change, even if they liked how it was. That is the whole point of the futurist part, which is the effective social part of fascism, which was preparing for this change and guiding it to where it needs to be. Now, we'll take a break here and look at the comments. First and foremost, we have Isaac here, an Argentinian, who comments that the transition to power wasn't soft. There was a military coup in the 1950s and 60s, I believe, but it was relatively quickly put down upon was brought back to power. After that, I don't believe there was a coup, although there was vague threats against his life, especially by terrorist groups. But I mean, effectively, it was the softest transition of power of a fascist state. And then we have Eternal Sane 4, race matters. It does not. Fascism has never been a racialist point. It's never been about racialism. Every single fascist leader, in fact, has stated that race is not a prevalent matter. It's not a matter at all, in fact. Mussolini famously stated that race is a feeling, that 95% so at least. Nothing will ever make him believe that biologically pure races can be shown to exist, and that national pride has no need of the delirium of race, that anti-Semitism did not exist in Italy under his rule. These are the simple facts of the fascist history. And that ties directly into the later years. Salazar, in his rule of Angola, realized that he couldn't rule over the people of, Angola, Mozambique, etc., the African peoples, as a colonizer. He realized that. And a lot of the European colonists didn't, but he did, first and foremost. And he stepped up and he made his point when he promoted this kind of miscegenation, this kind of race mixing in the colonies, in order to ensure that the strength of a nation would be interconnected with its ability to effectively rule over the people under it, including the Africans, the Angolans and Mozambicans, who radically assimilated directly into the Portuguese sensibility. And in fact, even married Portuguese women, or had their women married to Portuguese men, and they moved on. This was the reality. And I mean, in general, Mozambique and Angola, after this assimilationist view, radically changed in their sensibility towards Portugal. They welcomed the Portuguese. This was effectively the end of the former colonial wars, which had been happening. It was done completely by negotiation of assimilation. There was no issues with it. Same with Eritrea under Mussolini. Eritrea and Somalia saw massive assimilationist movements. I mean, it was extremely common. In fact, some people stated that one colonial judge in 1938 stated that it was so common for an Italian man to be married to a Eritrean woman that everybody had one at least, which is an interesting commentary made. The reality of fascism in the later years is that it recognized its early statements that race did not matter, especially where the colonial era was coming to an end. It realized that the sensibility of race and all that was a completely pointless sense of view. We have another question here. Dark X, what is your opinion on the Brazilian intergallist action? I find them interesting. I mean, intergallism, although it's closely connected to fascism, isn't directly fascist, although I believe the Brazilian intergallists were not strictly intergallists. I believe that they had a lot of connection to the fascist sensibility, although they were more traditionalist, which would put them closer to the sort of Salazarian view of fascism, especially on the social side. So, as an opinion, it's not that big. I mean, I never made much of a point on Brazilian intergallism. Our Argentinian friend is back. Yes, there was a military junta, and it did kill 30,000 people, except after that, Peron was invited back. That was my point. And then, of course, in our private chat here, we have a question from Cyanide. Does fascism have a bright future, and why? Absolutely. And I'd like to give some news out to those listening. With the recent developments, if you haven't seen what was already posted on our website, fascism has seen some interesting new actions, I guess you could say. Casa Pound recently rallied 3,000 black shirts into the streets of Rome, which led to no opposition. There was absolutely no Antifa present, and the whole meeting went off without a hitch. Apparently, it was a great event, and that was a very sensible point. It was a great time. Apparently, the whole meeting, the whole rally, everything went smooth. Thousands of fascists rallied to Rome without issue, and it showed that there was a large popular support for fascism, especially in Italy. And I mean, we're seeing this kind of stuff in Spain. We're seeing this kind of stuff in Slovakia, etc., where these fascist parties who had formerly been stepped on, relatively been outcasted to the corners of society, we're now seeing this reawakening, this comeback into the prominence of the world. And on our website, we talk about this, the newest article that we put out. Now, we're going to get back into the topic here, which is the corporate state and structure. We've talked about its governmental structure, but the local structure is just important. Now, Mosley, in Tomorrow We Live, discusses the importance of local government. Now, why he does this is because the fascist understands that the local government is the easiest way to communicate directly to the people at large. It is the easiest way to connect the people to the rulership of government. And that disconnect, which is curated by there being a national government and then nothing else, like you see under the communist regimes, where it's direct collectivization, top-down rule, complete centralization of everything. It curates this kind of disconnect between local peoples and the outer skirts of the nation and the central government. So a local government that is responsible for its people is extremely important, although it has to be completely and utterly subject to the central government, which is the point that Mosley makes in Tomorrow We Live, which is why I believe it important to bring up in the discussing of the corporate state and its structure, is that this, although it is a firmly national state, that does not completely remove the importance of the local government, the mayors, the local councils, etc., the county governments, etc., in order to ensure that there is swift, understandable organization and connection to the federal government or national government at every point of time, which is why there is that important bit. Outside its governmental structure, local, national, etc., we can talk about the economic implementation. I did touch on how there would be nationalization previously during my discussion of the National Council of Corporations, but the plan of nationalization has always been to ensure that there is no quote-unquote corporation, like an actual privately owned corporation. There's no mass big business. There's no international conglomeration of forces. And the reason that is because corporatism firmly believes something called a completely national market. And that means that there will be no foreign investation. There will be no investing of foreign funds into our national economy. There will be no pressuring of businesses, especially by international conglomerates, in order to force them into what they want to do, like you're seeing in Africa. There'll be none of that because the fascist state completely rejects that. We'll nationalize any attempt at it. The point is that businesses will be local. They will be locally owned, locally run, and I believe, in fact, the Italian Social Republic put out a number of employees that you could hold before the government would get involved, and I think that was 100 in the economization laws of the Italian Social Republic. Was that a business could have up to 100 employees before it became affiliated directly to a corporation, and then would have to be partially or fully nationalized depending on the connection. Now, another important piece of the fascist government, of course, is education. Education is completely national, and the Gentile reforms lay out its educational plan. Rather than being connected to some kind of set curriculum like the Victorian schooling system we currently employ, most of the world does, the plan instead is focused around a organic school system where teachers teach critical thinking and the ability to act independently rather than strict curriculum, rather than forcing them into this kind of narrow corridor of learning. The teacher's goal is instead to supply some kind of this critical thought, and it employ this in its students, and that will lead to an increased amount of academic performance. Alongside this, of course, the school system is nationalized, meaning that every sense of the way, all the way up to university, can be paid for depending on your talent. Now, Gentile stated out that in the beginning, the talented people of the academics would go to the academic universities. The talented people of the more physical would go into the free apprenticeships. And outside of that, you'd have to find your own way. Because the school system recognizes that not everybody can go to university. Not everybody can be a scholar, right? Everybody has a place in their life, has a job to do, and that is fulfilled. You will find contentment. This is basic Stoicism. It's best explained by Marcus Aurelius and his Meditations, which is suggested reading. And it effectively explains that the job of a person is to find where they are good at and find contentment in being good at that. And whatever they do, no matter how little it is, how minute, how unimportant on the grand scale, as long as they do it well, and that is their job in life, then they're doing all that they need to do, and they're fulfilling themselves with that work. Which is the important connection that fascism makes to the Stoic sensibility, especially with its education system, connecting directly to the Stoic sense of self-content, Stoic sense of ability, etc., etc. And that about does it for my discussion here, my explanation of the corporate state, its structure. If you have any questions regarding to the topic that have been discussed, feel free to state them now in the either the chat here in the YouTube live stream or in the server if you're in it. How did it work in practice? I did discuss practice in this episode here of the fascism. The point is that the in practice, right? So we did discuss a fair amount of theory, but in practice, its sensibility has already been explained. I explained how it worked in Italy. I explained how it worked in Spain and Portugal. But if you want, I can give another. I think next episode I'll do a completely practice, like a praxis kind of connection to the theory rather than just this kind of broad sensibility of discussion. So TFS, if you watch out for the next episode, which should be next week around this time, we will discuss just the practical implementations of fascism around the world. Eichmann here with horrific spelling. I heard you guys liked mood. Is this true? I don't know what you're saying, my man. Not at all. A 4chan meme. I guess with a name like Eichmann, that should be expected. Alright, so I'll give some announcements in the meantime. Well, I guess the people watching come up with some kind of questionnaire. Recently, one of the famous site Fascisti, which is an implementation of the CAUR in the modern day. I've explained that in the last episode. Has recently opened the door to creating a fully Americanized party for it. If you're interested, the person to reach out to would be to Kyle. If you're connected into the server, if not, you can just tag me wherever you are, and I'll get you the information for that, or go to our website. On the website, you can send us a message there, and we'll supply with the information in order to get affiliated with them. They are a true implementation of classical fascism, of the proper reading of theory, and they want to implement the CAUR's dream of an international fascist conglomeration of work. Now, the question from Dark X, I have a question. Do you think Mosley could have won the election if he planned out better the promotion of the rallies, at the same time not listening to people like William Joyce? Absolutely. His association with National Socialists was entirely connected to the, what's it called? To the needing for manpower. Because by 1934, a lot of the conservatives, if you will, had left. They realized that this movement wasn't what they thought it was, and a lot of them just outright left. Like, for example, the Daily Mail, which had initially supported the black shirts, realized now that this was not a pro-corporation movement, and thus they quickly left, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. But the ship was not sinking, and Mosley needed numbers in order to ensure that his rallies could go on, and he brought in National Socialists, mostly from Arnold Leese. Now, this was a mistake. And he recognized it as a mistake, and he kicked them out in a couple short years after things had stabilized again. But that had damaged his sensibility, it had damaged his connection. I definitely think that if there had been an election that he attended, especially at the time, which they were polling about 32% at their peak of the vote, if there had been an election at the time, definitely he would have at least gotten a plurality. They probably would have forced another election. Maybe done something similar to what Adolf Hitler had done in Germany, where he walked out if he didn't get the government. Although I'm not a supporter of the Nazis, I believe that sense of that tactic, if you will, of breaking liberal democracy is absolutely genius. Which is why I would support using it in a liberal democracy. And Vespian here. Maybe next time, man, we have our exit recording to be Primavera by the Division Azul for that. So yeah, next episode we'll be discussing the practical implementations of fascism around the world. We'll talk about some non-fascist examples, some fascism employed in non-fascist states, and things like that. Thank you all for joining me on this nearly 1 hour trip down the explanations of practical fascism, the later years, the corporate state and its structure. Thank you all for attending. Hope you all have a great night. Ave.
cabalgando, cabalgando con brío y valor, va cantando las tristes historias de una guerra que ya terminó. Primavera lejos de mi patria, primavera lejos de mi amor, primavera sin flores y sin risas, primavera guerra en el bolchón, y sus aguas que van a la doga van cantando esta triste canción, canción triste de amor y de guerra, canción triste de guerra y amor. Cuando ebrio avanza el enemigo, atacando con vodka y sin valor, rasga el aire más fuerte que la metralla, las estrofas de mi cara al sol. Cara al sol, canción antigua y nueva, cara al sol, es el himno mejor. Cara al sol y morir peleando, que mi patria sí me lo pidió. Si en la lucha yo quedara roto, marcharía en la Legión de Honor, montaría la guardia de los luceros, formaría junto al mejor, montaría la guardia de los luceros, formaría junto al mejor.